It was the middle of the night when Sarah woke up with a jolt. Her room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to smother the air. But it wasn't the absence of light that had disturbed her. It was the unmistakable feeling of eyes watching her. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the remnants of a bad dream. But as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shape of something in the corner of the room, its outline barely visible against the darkness. She squinted, heart pounding in her chest, thinking it was a trick of the light. But then it moved. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the figure shifted, slowly, almost deliberately. It was standing in the corner of her room, its features hidden, but the oppressive weight of its gaze was undeniable. The longer she stared, the more her body tensed. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to move, but her body betrayed her, frozen in place as if the fear had seeped into her very bones. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, but a presence that she felt inside her mind, it whispered, "I never left." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on her. The walls creaked as if the house itself were breathing, and the temperature plummeted. The figure stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer, tall, thin, and wrapped in something dark that clung to it like smoke. It moved closer, the air growing heavier with each step. Finally, she broke free from her paralysis, throwing herself out of bed, only to be met with the overwhelming silence of the room. The figure was gone, but the feeling, the sensation remained. Her mind raced, wondering if it was all in her head or if something truly had been there, watching her. As she stepped into the hallway, her gaze was immediately drawn to the mirror at the far end. And there, reflected in the glass, she saw it again just behind her, lurking in the shadows. It smiled, and her blood ran cold. That moment would never leave her. It stayed with her in every dark corner, in every silent room. The eyes were always there, watching. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling. No matter where she went, it lingered. Every time she turned a corner or entered a new room, her eyes would instinctively dart to the nearest reflective surface. The mirror, the window, even the polished kitchen counter. Each time, she saw its shadow lurking just beyond her own, its presence so suffocating that she could almost feel its cold breath on the back of her neck. At first, she tried to convince herself it was a hallucination, the product of a mind stretched too thin from stress. But no matter how hard she tried to push it away, the figure seemed to grow stronger. It was always there, just out of sight, but never far enough to feel safe. Days passed, and her friends and family noticed the change in her. She stopped sleeping, unable to rest with the persistent feeling of being watched. She became withdrawn, her eyes wide with a constant, unshakable fear. Her mother, concerned, suggested she see a doctor, but Sarah refused, unable to explain the terror that gripped her every time she tried to speak. Then, one evening, the worst happened. It was around midnight when Sarah heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on her bedroom window. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been staring at the wall, trying to keep her eyes away from the mirror, when the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. Terrified, she slowly approached the window, her mind screaming at her to stop. She pulled back the curtains and froze. There, staring back at her from the darkness, was the figure. But this time it wasn't in her room. It was outside. Its face was clearer now, a twisted grin stretched across its face, eyes wide open, glowing faintly in the night. The tapping continued, as if it were trying to get her attention, drawing her in. A sickening thought crossed Sarah's mind. It wasn't just watching her. It wanted her to come closer. With trembling hands, she pulled the window open, but before she could react, something cold and sharp gripped her wrist. She jerked back in shock, but the figure didn't move. It stayed frozen in place, its eyes locked onto hers, as if it were silently daring her to make the next move. Sarah stumbled back, but her feet caught on something, sending her crashing to the floor. As she scrambled to get up, she felt cold fingers brushing against the back of her neck. Panic surged through her, and she bolted for the door. But it was too late. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, a cold wave of darkness slammed into her, forcing her to her knees. The room seemed to warp around her, and in an instant, She was no longer alone. The figure was there, its twisted face hovering inches from hers, its breath foul and rancid. "You can't run from me," it whispered, its voice now clear, a deep, guttural growl that rattled her bones. "You never could." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The last thing she saw before everything went black was its eyes, those dreadful, burning eyes staring into her soul. And then silence. When Sarah's mother entered her room the next morning, she found the door locked. The air was thick with an unexplainable chill, and Sarah was nowhere to be found. The mirror on the wall was cracked, the shards scattered across the floor, reflecting the empty room. But in the broken glass, Sarah's face could still be seen, pale, wide-eyed, and staring back at herself with terror. And behind her, in the reflection, the figure stood, smiling.